Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I thank the organizers for inviting me and for Sigmund Freud University for hosting this conference on this really important topic. And I think in this really auspicious time to be talking about this topic, and I think it's brave actually to be talking about this topic, and I think oftentimes in academic settings and so I really appreciate and honor that we're having this discussion, and I think it's one that's really important. It's one that's really close to my heart, and that is, we are currently seeing so much turmoil in this world and so much crisis, and that has come to a head even in the past few weeks or in the past month, to the point where anybody, regardless of where people stand, are constantly being faced with a bombardment of trauma, whether it's our own trauma or that of people that are close to us or people that we feel connected to, so collective trauma, or even just now, in living in these contemporary times, we have this constant feed where we're exposed to trauma. And how we stay afloat and deal with this while still understanding our way of working with staying balanced in the world is something that everybody struggles with. Everybody, regardless of what faith they come from, or whether they have a faith, or whether it's in an entirely secular world, it is still difficult to understand how do we maintain resiliency amongst these contemporary times of so much trial, tribulation, and crisis. And, it's often perplexing, or people have different views of, well, where does religion come into play? And how can, oftentimes people see religion as the problem. And oftentimes the problem at the core of a lot of these crises. And so the tendency can be to take religion out of it and say, well, how do we need to be practical, because religion seems to be very abstract and theoretical, and or divisive. And so this idea of understanding how religion comes into play with resiliency is something that is sort of at the heart of my own journey into psychology. And it kind of stems back to bringing in, to this region, even being at Sigmund Freud University and here in Vienna, Austria, of many people seeing this as, Sigmund Freud's work being the where psychology stems from. And my own journey was informed by my grandfather. My grandfather was a pioneer in humanistic psychology, and he was a colleague of Fritz Perls, who is from Germany and developed Gestalt therapy. And so my grandfather was very involved in the development of Gestalt therapy and this sort of secular field of psychology. But before my grandfather passed away, Allah have mercy on his soul, he said to me that he was always working within this secular paradigm and secular context in terms of psychology. But before he passed away, he said to me that he wishes that he had looked into religion more to understand what religion could offer our understanding of psychology. And I sort of took that on as the carrying forward of his legacy, and felt like this is really what I feel called to, and where I feel is so fundamentally important, because all of the religions of our time throughout human history have offered resources and offered guidance for understanding the development of the human being, and somehow people have either misunderstood those things, they've become divisive, or they have been separated out from our understanding of humanity and the human condition. And there is a need to sort of bring these back together. And so this is what my approach to psychology is, also my approach to Islamic psychology. And so I actually found Islam. I wasn't born Muslim. I converted to Islam through trying to understand a spiritual approach to psychology. And I found this most developed in the Islamic tradition. And the thing is, we now call this field Islamic psychology, but it wasn't really a thing in this sense of referencing Islamic psychology, because in the Islamic tradition, psychology, or the way that word, actually what that word means, the study of the soul, is something that's integrated throughout the tradition, throughout the study of theology and the study of the Qur'an and hadith studies and akhlaq and tasawwuf. This is all different branches of knowledge within Islam, all that deal with the understanding of the soul. And so, why now we have this term Islamic psychology is because religion was separated from the way that we understand knowledge, because academia and science has become very secularized. And so there's this disaggregation of knowledge. And so now, when the rector had in his opening remarks, from what I understood from the translation, said that he had this conversation with this woman from Saudi, and that she said, well, we don't need psychology because we have everything in Islam. And the reality is, in essence, that is true. Islam contains within it an understanding not only of how we understand the human being and the development of the human being, but actually very practical steps towards that. The reality in our contemporary times, however, is that most Muslims are disconnected from this understanding of what the Islamic tradition has to offer, things like practical resiliency, and how all of the things within Islam can be what psychology offers. But what that requires is a reorientation to the Islamic tradition to understand it from the perspective of what we now understand as psychology, and to see it from a place of rather than just transaction. Meaning, oftentimes people's approach to religion or their orientation to religion is that of a transactional approach. We do behavioral things and then we expect an outcome. Versus understanding that these practices or tenets of Islam are actually there to evoke transformation. And that transformation is something that requires an internal process that people have to work on themselves, very much like we understand in the field of psychology. And so even though the answer is true, that Islam offers everything we need to understand it in this way and orient ourselves to Islam, to understand that it has practical guidance, and understanding it in a way that it is a transformational path. And so this is why, speaking of how do we understand resiliency and what religion has to offer, it's not just looking at the theological abstractions of religious ideas, but actually translating those into practical applications. And when I say translating, meaning that we have to now understand that from our contemporary mindsets where we have separated out religion from psychology. And in essence, there isn't really a separation, very much particularly within the Islamic tradition. And so rather than sort of seeing religion and psychology as two things that are strange to talk about in the same thing, it's actually coming to understand that what the term psychology, meaning the study of the soul, or the study of the psyche, let's say, how we define psyche is very much defined by how we understand our worldview. And from an Islamic perspective, how we understand the soul is an entire science. So that would inform then how we understand resilience and what Islam has to offer. So what I would like to talk about is, I know I've already been talking and now I'm going to introduce who I'm talking, but hopefully we can, well, I'll be introducing some things that could go extremely deep and we can go down lots of rabbit holes with this topic. And so what I plan to do is speak for no more than, well, now maybe 50 minutes or 45 minutes, and then I'd like to be able to have some time for question and answer at the end, because this way there can be more of an engagement rather than just me speaking. But so what I'd like to talk about is just talk about what is resilience, how even from the secular field of psychology, how do we understand resilience, and then how can it be built, as this is our topic, and then understanding what that means specifically from an Islamic perspective, and then understanding what some concepts from Islamic psychology that help put this into focus, and then talking about practical approaches for building resiliency. So this is the definition of resilience from the American Psychological Association: the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. And the American Psychological Association gives these points of how a number of factors that contribute to how people adapt to adversity. So, and the three that they name are ways in which the individuals view and engage with the world, the availability and quality of social resources, and strategies. Wow. I should tell you what's under that. Specific coping strategies, right? So what I want to talk about these things in the context of an Islamic perspective. So that first point, the ways in which individuals view and engage with the world. So this is about worldview. How we understand ourselves and our place in the world very much impacts how we approach resilience. And we can think about worldview in a number of ways, and oftentimes from a secular perspective, this is very relative, right? Everybody has their own relative view of how they see the world. But if we're talking about an Islamic paradigm, so here when I reference Islam, I'm not talking about just Muslims, I'm not talking about people who identify as Muslim and their Muslim experience. I'm actually talking about the theological construct of Islam, and therefore we're going to be talking about that within this Islamic paradigm. So assuming that everything that the Qur'an sets forth as reality from an Islamic perspective, that would then inform the worldview. Ideally, the Muslim worldview, somebody who is aligned with an Islamic paradigm, which isn't always an assumption that can be made. Sometimes we can identify as Muslim, but actually not really have a core understanding of what Islam says about the world and our position in it. And so, from this Islamic paradigm, the way that the human being is positioned in this world is understood that this life, this temporal life, is a temporary test, meaning that we existed before this life. This is I'm speaking from Islamic perspective. We existed before this life, and we will exist after this life. And during this life, the life that we know about ourselves from birth until this moment is temporary, it's fleeting, and it is for the purpose of coming into awareness of what is real. And the reality being beyond just what we can see here. So what this means is that the larger cosmological reality is veiled to us in this world. And so the idea of it being a test is that we don't just take at face value what this temporal world is. So whatever we see here happening, whatever we experience as separate individuals, is somehow not the full picture. And so, from an Islamic perspective, how one would be more resilient through dealing with the ups and downs and the tragedies and the adversities in this life is understanding that they are not the end-all be-all. That the adversities in this life are for a purpose of testing us to stay firm in truth. And that truth is beyond this temporary experience. And so, in order to be resilient from this Islamic perspective, one would need to be anchored in these eternal realities. So they're anchored in the notion of self that is beyond just my experience of myself as separate, and not anchored in the things that are fleeting, meaning all of the crises that are happening, that are constantly kind of ebbing and flowing, or the changes that occur constantly throughout this life, not anchoring ourselves in trying to master or trying to get control within this temporal world of crises, but understanding that this is fleeting. And so we're anchoring ourselves in a notion that the true life, the eternal life, the longer lasting life, is beyond this dunya, this temporal life. And so this is going to have a major impact on the ability of one to be resilient through life's trials if we see those life trials as the end-all be-all, meaning trying to make sense of why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? Or why is this happening to us? Or why is this happening in this world? If you don't have an understanding of an akhirah, an afterlife, or a continuation, then it's going to be very hard to make sense of these tragedies that never seem to come to resolution or justice. There's always another one, right? And so then the person, in order to be resilient, is anchoring in this idea that understanding what is yours to control and what is God's to control. And so this level of control, oftentimes we're trying to get control over the things in our life, and we're focused on controlling things that we fundamentally don't have control over. Regardless of somebody's religious orientation, most people will realize that the things that they're trying to control, at the end of the day, they realize I don't actually have control over other people, other things, right? And so Islam is positing that actually we shouldn't really busy ourselves with things that are not in our control, and there is very little that is in our control. And so this very little that is in our control is our internal locus of control. So we have an internal locus of control and an external locus of control. External locus of control being that which is outside of our agency, things that happen to us, like natural disasters or crises, or even whether you get a job or not, right? I can apply to the job, but I can't determine whether I get it. So there is the internal locus of control is I can make the application and I can spend the time to make it a good application, but whether I get accepted or not my control. But often we concern ourselves with the things that are not in our control, the external locus of control, and that makes us sort of spiral out of control. So if you look at this image, if the middle center is sort of ourself, and the external factors that are around us, when we focus on things that are not in our control, like I said, we can spiral out of control. We can get into a sense of, if we focus on the past, oftentimes this is what we live in as contemporary individuals. We're either worried about something in the past, and we have huzn, or in Arabic, huzn means sadness, or can be even grief about something that you don't have control over that has already passed, or we're worried about what's going to happen in the future. And we can have hum, or anxiety, or worry about what's going to happen. Either of these two things, in past or future, are not within our control, right? What was in the past no longer exists. What's in the future doesn't yet exist. So the only thing that is in existence in reality is the present. And so when we focus on all of these things that are outside of our control, like I said, whether we get the job, where we're going to be in 5 years, whether I'm going to be where I want to be, or whether I avoid the disasters that I want to try to avoid. I can't control these things. When I'm focused on them, we feel, we spiral. And so, internal locus of control is focusing on that which we do fundamentally have control over. And so, from an Islamic perspective, what we have control over is our thoughts, our feelings, our intentions, and to a certain degree, our actions. Meaning, what we choose to do, but not what happens as an outcome from what we choose to do. So we can direct ourselves towards an outcome, and that's something that we have to do by embracing action. But then we divorce ourselves from the outcome, because as soon as we focus on the outcome, or let's take global crises that are happening. There's things that are happening across the world that are horrible tragedies that we may not feel like we can impact. And yet we're focused on what I need to do something. How can I do something? The only thing that we can do are things that are within our internal locus of control. And there's quite a bit that can impact the world if we focus on what we have to focus on. And so when we focus on the internal locus of control, what that does is it puts us into agency with ourselves. And so when we're talking about building resiliency, when we're focused external, we're going to be the opposite of resilient, because we're going to constantly be frustrated and knocked down with feeling like we can't do anything. And we get sort of bent out of shape. We can get depressed. We can get overcome with anxiety. But when we focus on what is within ourselves and change what is within ourselves, then we can actually make an impact and feel solid, feel more in control, right? So basically what it is when we focus on things we don't have control of, we feel out of control. When we focus on things that we have control over and understand what those things are, we feel in control. And so what it is, it's putting ourselves in proper relationship from a aqidah perspective, aqidah being the way the theology or tenets of faith that are aligning with the Islamic paradigm, the Islamic reality of things. And so this idea of focusing on what we have to focus on, in the Qur'an, it says Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. So what is within ourselves is what we're talking about. Our thoughts, our feelings, our state, the state of our internal being, which is something that takes internal work, right? So something that we understand through the field of psychology is how do we change our feelings, change our thoughts, right? And so the interesting thing about this ayah in the Quran is that what Allah is presenting is somewhat of a paradox, right? So he's saying that there's this concept of qadr, of that things happen because God wills them to happen. And yet we all have the experience of having free will. We have individual agency. And so there's often this misunderstanding. How do we make sense of that? If I'm in charge of my own life, but Allah is in charge of everything, what does that mean? And the only way that we can understand this is if we understand and embrace the notion of paradox. Meaning that there are different dimensions of reality where things can be true at the same time. So what's true is that the individual has free will within a certain dimension. Right? Within this physical, manifested, temporal realm, we have free will. But what the Quran says is Allah does not change the condition of a people. Meaning the changing of a condition is within the realm of God's control. And yet, there's something that the human being has to do to enact change. And so this is a notion of paradox. And there's a paradox that the dunya, this temporal realm, is all about paradoxes, because we are trying to make sense of this world based on what we see. And what the Qur'an is positioning, or the Islamic paradigm is positioning, is that what you see is not all that there is. That there is a temporal, manifest experience of reality, and there is a hidden, unseen reality. And so this means that when it comes to understanding our action, we have to understand that action is required. We have to do something. Allah is saying we are not going to change unless we change what's in ourselves. But we're not focused on the outcome of the action, because that's outside of external locus of control. We're focused on the moment. In the present moment is where we can be aligned with this paradigm, and therefore be building resiliency. The more that we are focused on what is ours to focus on. So basically we do our part, we work in the world, and that can look like being active in social justice, let's say. Right now, there's a lot of people focused on fighting for justice because they see injustice happening, and the focus is on, let me act to bring justice into the world. And so Islam says that the Muslim is supposed to stand up for the truth and act for justice in the world. But what Allah also tells us in the Quran is that God is al-adl. Allah is the just. Meaning that the notion of justice has a full reality in Allah's bringing of justice. And so what happens is, if we focus on our own determination of what is just, and we pursue the outcome of justice based on what we perceive, this is going to throw us into a place where we're constantly cycling and feeling out of control and feeling in states of depression and anxiety. Whereas if we, in the current moment, stand up for what is just, do what we know, what we feel compelled to do for the sake of what's right, but we leave the outcome of what is the ultimate justice in God's hands, then this is how we can correct our right relationship with reality. And so it's about being a servant. So the whole Islamic paradigm is the human being an Abdallah, being a servant of God. And so we're aligning our will, submitting our will to the will of God, and trusting that there is wisdom in what is happening, even though it may not make sense to us. We're seeing death and destruction, and we're seeing injustice. And so we have to act for justice, but recognize that the justice may not happen in this world. Because the ultimate deliverance of justice is something that is beyond just this temporal world, because the full reality involves life, the longer lasting life, is beyond this dunya, this temporal life. And so this is going to have a major impact on the ability of one to be resilient through life's trials, if we see those life trials as the end-all be-all, meaning trying to make sense of, why is this happening?
Whereas if you're standing up for the truth, because that's what we need to do in our agency, but letting go of the outcome and saying, this is not within our understanding of what's going to come to fruition, this is how we
leave things. And we have tawakkul. Tawakkul meaning trust in God, trust in God's plan. And so what this means is the person, the human being, still needs to act, still needs to use their agency, but leaving the outcome to God. And this is how one is able to stand firm in being grounded in these realities. And so true resilience comes from balancing realities, meaning recognizing that the Islamic paradigm says that there are multiple dimensions of reality. There's the seen, manifest world, and there's the unseen. And so when we forget about the unseen, when we take out this religious, theological worldview, and we only deal with what we can see and what we can measure and what we cause and effect, then we're only dealing with one limited dimension of reality, and that's going to throw us off in terms of being resilient. And so it's recognizing and embracing these multiple dimensions of reality, and doing that in a sense of understanding where we stand as human beings as a soul, not just the self. So what I mean by that is, in secular psychology, we come to understand ourselves based on the memories of who we are from birth up until this moment. And we often interact with the world based on this projected notion of our separate self. But what the Islamic paradigm is presenting or positing is that the reality is tawheed, oneness, unicity, interconnectedness. And so our experience of being separate individuals is a veil to what is true. The true reality from the Islamic perspective is that the human being is a servant of God. And we perceive in this manifest reality that we have free will and that we're individual separate beings. So again, paradox. And so in order for one to be grounded and resilient, one needs to stand in both realities. So if we look at it as if our projected self, the social identity that we have based on I'm from Austria, I'm from Syrian descent, I'm a doctor, and I identify with XYZ, right? Those are notions of who we are that are based only in this temporal manifest world. So if this line is from birth until the present moment, and who we understand who we are based on this horizontal reality, just this physical realm. But the reality is that we have a prenatal identity and a post-mortem identity, meaning ourself, from Islamic perspective, didn't just occur at birth and won't just stop at death. There was all souls existed before this world. From Islamic perspective, it says that all souls existed and recognized their servanthood of Allah, recognized their reliance on Allah. And then when they came into this world, that was veiled, and we see ourselves as separate. And so when we only stay with the reality of ourselves as separate, we are going to be dealing with half of the reality. And then our post-mortem identity is that this life isn't the end. There is another life after this, which will determine our full notion of who we are as a soul, as an eternal soul, rather than just a temporary separate self. And so if we look at this horizontal line of our notion of self, this is where we can get really caught up in the dunya, caught up in the temporal world. And we can stay focused on being anxious about outcomes. So if we think of the story of Hajar in the desert looking for water, running between Safa and Marwa. This is the story of Hajj. Hajar is running between Safa and Marwa looking for water for herself and for her son, for her people. And she's dealing with the realities of how do I meet the needs of myself and my children. And this horizontal relationship of where do I find the water and and so it's going back and forth between point A and point B. And it was at the point that she relied on and looked to the vertical relationship of beyond this temporal world and looked to God for help. At that point, the answer came. The well of Zemzem came forward and her needs were met. Her needs were met through an understanding that just this temporal reality isn't where we're getting our needs met. It is a veil to how we get our needs met through asbab, through vehicles in the physical world. And so this vertical reality is something that has to be taken into consideration when we understand ourselves in this world and our orientation to it. And so Hajar's awareness of God, taqwa, God consciousness, allowed for her resilience, for her to deal with the trial and the tribulation, and to recognize that Allah is Ar-Razaq, the provider. But she needs to still run between Safa and Marwa to deliver through physical means. Asbab. So that means both the physical, the horizontal and the vertical are equally important in order to stay grounded in reality from this Islamic paradigm. And so when we look at this, if our life is veiled to just the horizontal, right? Because that's what we can see, our relationships, our separate self. But what we need to do is, to be grounded in this idea is recognize the spiritual dimension. So this circle above represents the spiritual dimension that is unseen, but that Allah in the Qur'an tells us exists. And then this bottom circle represents the physical realm, which we are familiar with because it's manifest. We can see it, right? The human being exists in between these two worlds. The human being is a spiritual reality and a physical reality, and exists in both. So the jism, the body, is our manifested self, right? We exist in the body, but our body exists both in the physical realm and the unseen spiritual realm. And when the body is, where the body rather is overlapping or experienced in the manifest, in the physical, we have a nafs, this sense of ourselves as separate. The nafs being what we would say in English or in psychological terms, the self, this projected self. But when our being, or where our being is interacting with the unseen spiritual dimension, the ruh is the reality of ourself. We have this spiritual, the ruh means spirit. So it is this spiritual reality of the human being that is connected to God and that is pure. That is essentially the self that is witnessing God, that is unveiled to reality. So we have, every human being from an Islamic worldview, every human being has a ruh, a part of themselves that is pure, that is the original soul that is witnessing God in truth. But that gets covered up when we stay with the physical world. And so the thing that regulates these two potentialities of whether we're seeing the truth of multi-dimensions of reality or staying with the physical separateness is the state of our heart, the qalb. The heart is the center of the human being from an Islamic psychological perspective, not the mind. The mind is an important feature of the human being, but the heart is the center. And it's what regulates the relative position of where the person is grounded in their full reality from an Islamic worldview. And when we cover over the ruh through forgetting about the unseen, forgetting about God, and forgetting about the human being's original witnessing, then this heart can become covered. And when the heart is covered over, it covers, we stay stuck in the nafs. We stay stuck in the frustration and the depression and the anxiety and the focusing on our external locus of control because we're not oriented towards the locus of our being in the heart and cleaning the places in our heart that get stuck on the temporal world. And so the object of why I'm illustrating these things is that in order to be resilient, one has to be grounded in reality. And so from an Islamic perspective, there are multiple dimensions of reality, and one needs to fully occupy all of them, or in this case, both of them. The physical, meaning showing up to the physical world, doing the actions we need to do, being responsible, not just sitting back and saying, oh, well, everything is in Allah's hands, so I'm not going to act. It's being present to the world, standing up for truth and justice, but then knowing spiritually that the outcome of the justice is in Allah's hands. And so it's being awake to these different realities that allows somebody to be resilient and not be knocked off every time that there is a crisis, because we're trying to make sense of it based on what makes sense in the cause and effect material world. And so some of the concepts that are really important in understanding this from Islamic psychology are that, we often talk about in philosophy, there's this mind-body problem. The mind is understood as the center of the human being. I think, therefore I am. This is a philosophy that is foreign to Islam. That we're not just material beings, it's not Cartesian dualism, it's an integral understanding of the self, and that the body is not separate from the mind or consciousness. One of the scholars, Mullah Sadra, says that the body is a dense manifestation of the soul. So what that means is that the soul, this spiritual reality of the human being, this is what the soul looks like in this manifest physical realm, the body. And so why is it important to be embodied and to be physically present in our body is so that we can be aligned with the full reality of our soul, because our soul is our body. So why in Islam all of the ibadah, or all of the worship, practices of worship, are embodied. Prayer is physical. You bend, you bow, you put your head on the floor. Our ablution is embodied. Our practices are aligned with the cycles of the moon and in nature. And so all of these things are aligning the spiritual reality with the physical reality. The horizontal and the vertical coming into alignment at once. And so the heart being the center, the axis point of those two vertices, of the horizontal and the vertical, of these dimensions of reality, the heart being the absolute center, and the way to access is by being present in the present moment and present in the heart. And that presence, this is covered up, it says presence allows for surrender. So surrender, being the ultimate goal of a Muslim, is to be in a state of surrender. So these are factors that are going to be how we build resiliency from this Islamic perspective. So if we look at this hadith, how amazing is the affair of the believer? Indeed, his entire affair is good. And this is not the case with anyone except the believer. Should prosperity come his way, he is grateful, and that is good for him. And should adversity come his way, he patiently perseveres, and that is good for him. So now this is a hadith that is often referenced with things like dealing with diversity or adversity and difficulty. But what I think is sometimes missed here is the assumption that just by being a believer, you should already be able to deal with this. And so oftentimes people say, oh well, if you just cling to be a good Muslim, then you won't have any problems. You should be resilient. It's just the more iman that you have, the more faith that you have, you'll automatically just be in this state. But the reality is that when we're talking about the believer isn't somebody who just cognitively attributes a belief and signs up to a club of being Muslim. It is somebody who is actually in a state of Islam. Is somebody who is embodying the state of being Muslim. So this is what this is referring to. And in order to be in a state of being a Muslim, that requires constant work, constant engagement, constant changing what is within ourselves. Remember, Allah does not change the people until they change what is within themselves. This is what is required in order for this hadith to really be applicable. One has to be in the state of a believer. So if we look at the definition of Muslim, if you just Google what does Muslim mean, the definition that comes up usually is a follower of the religion of Islam. But what we know in looking at the Arabic, a Muslim, if we just look at what does the word mean, it's one who surrenders to God and who is whole or intact, and then who is in a state of Islam. And so Islam is not necessarily this, what we understand of as an organized religion. It is a state of being. So it's actually a verbal noun. That means the state of being surrendered to God. And then by being in this state of surrender, one experiences peace or wholeness. And so this is something that a state, or in Arabic, hal, is something that is temporary. We have to constantly impact and affect our state, and we can fall out of state. So you could be Muslim one moment, and you can fall out of Islam the next moment. Just because you culturally identify as a Muslim does not mean you're good. And just because you behaviorally follow the religious edicts or practices of Islam does not necessarily mean that your state will change. They both have to happen at the same time. So the religious practices are for the purpose of impacting one's state and transforming the internal reality of the human being. But it is possible for one to just orient themselves to the behaviors and not actually be in a state of Islam. And so this is where, when we think, well, how can religion be a tool for helping resiliency? If our orientation to religion is just behavioral, then maybe not necessarily will it provide that much help. Whereas if we orient to it into the way that it's meant to be, both the physical and the spiritual, the seen and the unseen, then it can be a process of regrounding ourselves to align with reality, which then fortifies the human being to be in a state of resilience. So being Muslim is not a static thing. We're not statically Muslim. Our nafs constantly fluctuates. The nafs, the sense, the self, the separate self that we experience in this world is fluctuating. And it fluctuates based on our engagement with the dunya, and the dunya is constantly fluctuating. There's constantly crises happening. We get things and we're happy, we lose things, we become sad. We have safety, we feel calm, we lose safety, we're out of whack, right? And so our nafs is constantly up and down based on the up and down of the dunya. And so what we need to do is be able to build resilience, build stability amongst the instability of the dunya, of this veil of reality in this temporary world. And so that requires constantly cultivating Islam, striving to be Muslim, not just identifying culturally as a Muslim, as a social identity, or as a behavioral practice, but actually being Muslim. And so there are many practical approaches within the Islamic tradition that help build resiliency, and that help build one being in a state of Islam. So some Arabic terms, muraqaba often is thought of as, or translated as, meditation, but really it means watching the self. And so muraqaba is a state of self-awareness, of being present with oneself to be able to notice what is happening within your heart. Often we're disconnected from the internal reality of ourselves and our heart, and we're just oriented to the world behaviorally. And so we respond to external factors, and we don't have this self-introspective awareness. So muraqaba is a practice, like it can sometimes look like meditation, because in order to cultivate a state of muraqaba, one needs to practice being conscious and aware and watching the self. And so one can do this on a daily basis of just sort of paying attention internally, but ultimately muraqaba is something that ideally is practiced as you're living life. So as you're living life, you recognize when you react to the ups and downs. So when you are triggered by an event, you notice the change of your state. This takes a level of self-awareness, watching the self. So this is a practice that one needs to be engaged with. And then once you have done, not singularly, it's an ongoing thing, but when you are in a practice of muraqaba and you're able to see yourself changing, your reaction to things, then doing muhasabah, meaning muhasabah is self-introspection. So then you take account of your state. So meaning you notice your reaction to something, then you do muhasabah and you start to look at, why did I react that way? What was the trigger that threw me off, that threw me out of balance? And now you start to collect the data and start to be consciously aware of what is it that is throwing me off, what is the trigger? So maybe that we're triggered by a certain event that reminds us of something in our past, something in our history, that we haven't yet sorted out. And so by doing this practice of muhasabah, we're able to look at, okay, where do I need to reorient myself with my life and the external realities to change what I have control over, which is my internal state. We won't be able to change the thing that's triggering us, right? Because it's not us, it's something external to us. But what we can change is our reaction to it. And that requires us being in a state of awareness and presence to be able to make an internal change. Tafakkur is contemplation. Why is this important? Is because it is a practice of cultivating a state of presence, or hudur. And there is many ayahs in the Qur'an that talk about yattafakkarun, those who contemplate, those who look at Allah's creation in nature or in the stars or in Allah's creation and reflect. And that reflection starts externally, like saying, wow, isn't that amazing? Look at all of the things, there must be something bigger than me. Or even just being around trees in nature, you're impacted by this. If you ever sit in front of a tall mountain, we get in a state of feeling small, feeling like you're part of something, and then it impacts your state, right? Most people, when they're in nature, their state is impacted. So then we use that through our senses to then impact our internal state. And it becomes this practice of being in a contemplative state so that you're building your ability to control your internal locus of control, to stay grounded in the remembrance of all multiple dimensions of reality. And then riyadat an-nafs means the sort of like engagement in the changing of yourself. So this can be, there's other words like tazkiyat an-nafs, the purification of the self. There's tahdhib al-akhlaq, the refinement of character. Riyadat an-nafs is all of these practices that are trying to counterbalance your reactions and your behaviors through these practices of muraqaba and muhasabah, and then what we do to discipline ourselves so that we can stay awake and aware and grounded in this worldview that is beyond just trying to make sense of things on this disjointed, disaggregated, physical, measurable understanding. So we're keeping ourselves accountable by discipline. So if we look at the Islamic tradition, there's a lot of guidance for what we need to do to maintain and stay grounded and be resilient. So if we look to even just physical discipline. So oftentimes people think of these, there's many, but the Prophet, some talked about what people refer to as sunnah sports: archery, horse riding, swimming, and wrestling. These were 4 things that the Prophet specifically prescribed that people do. They can be called sports, but the reason I don't use the word sports is because it's not just a meaningless pastime for fun. They are disciplines. So the reason why all of these align the body with the soul, and they put ourselves in tune. So for one example is the Prophet, there's a hadith that the Sahaba were in battle and they experienced trauma of the battlefield. Now we know people coming back from war, they have post-traumatic stress disorder, right? They came back from war and they were impacted by the trauma of seeing their brothers killed, or even their enemies killed in front of them. And so the Prophet told them to go practice archery. He wasn't saying, oh, your archery was bad, you need to be better, so practice it. The reason why he had them practice archery is because it helped integrate the trauma in their body. So when we stretch like this, and we're aiming and we're focusing and we're connected to breath, we're connected to the physicality of the body, we're connected to our intentions, and we're focused on what we can control. Making the arrow aimed and letting go. And so this is a practice of healing the body and healing the trauma in the body. So there's all this deep science of these disciplines that are necessary for us to be in tune. So physical activity is really important. And being in nature is fundamental to the deen of Islam. the Prophet said that the whole earth is a place of prostration, right? And he often put his head on the ground, prayed on the ground, made a connection with the earth. He would spend time in nature. The original Sahabi, they would live outdoors a lot. They would ride horses to get, to get around. They were constantly in the natural world. That allows us to be aligned with our full reality and makes one stronger, makes one more able to deal with calamities better. Because when things happen, you're here, you're solid, you know who you are, you can deal with it, and you can absorb trauma and difficulty and adversity more. Connection to breathing. A lot of people say, I'm constantly helping people learn to breathe. And people say, well, where's the hadith about breathing? Where is that in the Islamic tradition? But if you look at all the other things that they did, like swimming, archery, horse riding, working outside, growing their own food, walking, riding horses. If you've ever ridden a horse, you can't ride a horse without being connected to your breath and being in the present moment. Otherwise, you'll get thrown off of the horse. So our lifestyles today are so sedentary and disconnected from fitra, or natural lifestyle, that we now need to learn how to be in our bodies and learn how to breathe. Whereas if we were living the way that is natural, breath and being connected to breath would be natural, and it would naturally align somebody with being strong and solid in themselves and build resilience. And then practicing contemplation is being in these states of presence often. Rest and rejuvenation. I'm going to move quickly through these last slides. Rest and rejuvenation is fundamental. Oftentimes I hear, especially now, people are constantly trying to do something to help the situation in the world and feel guilty for resting, right? Because they know people are suffering constantly and they don't get to rest. And so what we do is we feel guilty and say, okay, well, I'm not going to rest because other people aren't resting. I need to constantly post on social media or whatever it is that I'm doing in the world. The fundamental thing is when we don't rest, we become depleted and we're less able to do anything to help anybody else in the world. And rest is something that is fundamental to cycles. Every cycle has to have a rest in it. So balancing jalwa and khalwa, these are two Arabic words. It's interesting that they rhyme, but jalwa means the social engagement, the social reality. When we're in the world and we're dealing with people and we're dealing with adversity and social engagement. Khalwa means retreat, when you go away from the social engagement. If we look at the life of the Prophet, he was mostly in jalwa. He was mostly dealing with diplomacy and helping people with their problems and fighting up for injustice but then always he would go and be in retreat. So he would go into the cave for a certain period of time and stay alone. And what he was doing is he wasn't reading, we know that he didn't read, he wasn't with other people, so he wasn't in conversation. He was in a state of presence with Allah, and he was being in a state of rejuvenation and rest. And then, even on his daily routine, so this was like every once in a while, maybe once a month or once every 2 months. But if you look at his daily routine, every single night, for the last third of the night, he would be alone in prayer and in contemplation. And then, in the day, as he's dealing with all of this adversity and crises and everything, he would take a qaylula, a nap. This is sunnah. It's not laziness, it's a necessary routine that builds resiliency. So these are the sunnah that we need to look at, not just, the length of the pants and the length of the beard. Self-care, we often now talk about self-care as doing what you want to do. Do what is good for you, like eat the ice cream and indulge in the pizza and, watch Netflix. That's healthy for a certain degree, to a certain degree. But at some point it's recognizing what is fueling your nafs versus fueling the ruh. So fueling your separate sense of self and your notion of what you need versus what your spirit needs, what your soul needs to be fortified in its full reality. And so self-care, in this standpoint, means the rest and rejuvenation from a spiritual level. doing physical activity, eating healthy, staying aware and awake to the full picture, not getting caught up on the illusions and the delusions of the physical realm. And then social resources. Remember, the APA talked about social resources being important for resilience. So this is integral into the Deen of Islam. We have the Jama'ah, right? The Jummah prayer, but also there's many things that rely on being in community. And there's this aspect of being in suhbah being companionship, that we rely on other people for support. We rely on other people for being able to see what we can't see. We rely on other people to have strengths that we don't have. So there's strength in numbers. As community, we need to build structures for resiliency where there is communal support. We live in a contemporary world where it's based on, in the West anyway, there's this individualistic society. Whereas Muslim cultures, culturally, are collectivist. But that can be out of balance. Because oftentimes Muslim collectivist cultures can be only thinking of the collective and neglecting the self. There has to be a balance. So often, lately I've been hearing things about, criticism of people of like the self-help or self-care movement of just taking care of yourself, while there's people suffering based on systemic colonial injustices. And so how can you take care of yourself when the collective is suffering? That is true. There is no, just as in Islam says, if you kill one person, it's as if you killed all humanity. And we're not meant to stay up on the hill and be in a state of peace, right? We're supposed to be engaged in the world. We're supposed to be supporting one another. But khalwa and jalwa, there's a percentage there. If you look at the Prophet, he was like 85% in dealing with the difficulty in the community and making sure everybody is okay, and about 15% making sure he was having time for himself. And so it's not one or the other, it's both and. We have to do both, but we have to fundamentally think communally. So discipline is fundamental, right? Individual discipline. So yes, we have to do communal work, but individually, each individual has to change what is within themselves, and they do that through discipline. That's how we build resiliency, but it's fundamental that the discipline we're talking about is built on love and mercy. That has to be in the community, love and mercy, but also individually with the self. And unfortunately, many people's relationship to Islam even has been that of a very unmerciful approach. They've been taught that Allah is an unmerciful God. They've learned about Islam through very difficult, hard ways. And so a lot of the healing, in order to be able to access these tools, is to ground oneself in mercy, being merciful with the self. Allah calls himself Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. And so we have to build this into the discipline. Just like you would discipline a child that you love out of love. Not because you want to punish them, but you are harsh with them from love. So it's very important that we establish discipline routines in order to build resiliency. Physical disciplines, being in nature, connection to breathing, these things that we talked about before. And always, as this hadith says, it's always about taking on only what you can do. So you commit to small things that you can keep constant. Not necessarily thinking you're going to take on the whole world and do everything that you want to do, because then you'll lose it. So the idea is that we want to have constancy so that we can, our nafs is fluctuating like this. If we only do things when we're on the up, so we have ups and downs. If we only do the things we need to do when we're on the ups, then the fluctuation is taking control of us, rather than the discipline routine happening constantly that will create this tightrope. It will create less slack in our ability to get unwound and keep a tightrope through constant practice. So this is just a summary of points from the talk. Thank you so much for your patience, and look forward to engaging with you more.